Sweet. Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for coming today to our online visiting artist series. Today, we're joined by Jessica Lancaster, who's a really close friend of mine. We've been friends for about 10 years now. We went to college together. Amazing photographer, painter, now mirror maker. She's going to share a little bit about her process. And Jess, yeah, why don't you start by telling us a little bit about you and where you come from, and then we can move on from there.
Yeah,
Does that sound good?
yeah, I'm originally from Detroit, but I grew up in Canada, so right across the border. There's a river, so then there's bridges and tunnels you can cross, and so I kind of bounce on both sides of the border. I had a really weird high school experience where I went to 3 different high schools, and at one point I was commuting from Canada to Michigan during my sophomore year to attend a public school. So I was like getting up at 5:30 in the morning to make it to class by like 8:30. Sometimes I would show up super early. Sometimes I would show up hours late, and my teachers would scream at me for being tardy all the time because you were crossing an international border. So it was like attending a new school, being the new kid with no friends, and also being like the amount of stress that goes into just like trying to just make it through high school was really, really rough. And I think like for a lot, I mean, I'm sure some of you as well feel the same way, but like art has always been like that one safe place for me. So in high school, I was like always doodling, or like that was like a huge habit of mine. I like through high school was like coming home, putting on a record, and just like drawing until I had chores to do. I would like play around with painting, and then I took a photography class that year. I was commuting, and that was like the one thing that saved me, that like kept me sane. So it was like really nice to like learn how to develop my own film and like make my own prints. And that's something I kind of kept as a habit of just taking pictures throughout high school, along with like still drawing and stuff. And so senior year, I started kind of having to make the decision of like what path was I going to take for college. And I was interested in journalism. I was always interested in like history and like storytelling, but I really wanted to do journalism, but I was like, maybe like, I wasn't sure. And I had teachers at school kind of more push me into the visual route because they knew that was my strong point. So I stumbled upon the Corcoran, where Jason and I both went to school, and they had a photojournalism program. So it was kind of like the perfect mix between photography and journalism. Got there, and I was like all gung-ho on being like, I'm gonna be a PJ major. I am going to like, work for Nat Geo in 4 years. Like I was very naive going into that program. My first year, I got met with foundation courses. So we had to take drawing again, like do still lives and work with models. We had a sculpture course that we had to take with woodshop and metalworking. And I was like, I'm not learning how to be a photographer. So I kind of had like an existential crisis and switched my majors 3 times that first year. And finally decided that I'll just stick with fine art photography. And as I, worked more in the photography department, I realized I was a really, really bad black and white printer. They were either, I was not a good black and white printer, I'll admit it. They were either like the contrast was always way too high, or they were like way too gray. And so to make up for that discrepancy, I started like adding color to my black and white prints. So like I would use watercolor or like colored pencils. Like I would draw them and like make these really fine detailed drawings. And the faculty did not appreciate that. We went to a very strict like school of photography where you took pictures and that was it. There was no kind of modifying it. And that, I kind of did that for like my first 2 years. And I signed up for an analog color photography course. And that was, I like fell in love. Printing analog color images is super different than that in like a traditional darkroom, or like what you would think about, or like what you see in movies, or if you've even experienced yourself like printing in a black and white darkroom. There is no red lamp. There is no light. You do it completely in the dark. And I like that, of the muscle memory needed, and like the memory of like, where did you put your scissors? Where is the timer to the enlarger? How do I make sure my negative carrier is in there the right way? It was like this challenge I needed in order to properly make images. And like color made a lot more sense to me than than just tones. And so now to jump kind of up to my last year of college, we had to propose our thesis to the faculty, and I wanted to tell a story. And so I proposed to the faculty that I would go back to Detroit and photograph the city in 2012, 2013. And at that time, to give you some context, Detroit was filing for bankruptcy. They were broke. And they had just kind of wrapped up some controversy with their former mayor. The city was in really bad shape. Jason, I see that you asked me a question. What other schools were you interested in when you were applying for schools? I looked at MICA, and I had applied there. I was accepted there in Baltimore. And then I also applied to the photography program at College for Creative Studies in Detroit. And I really love the College for Creative Studies, but I just didn't want to go to school where I grew up. So that was kind of the Corcoran. Plus the Corcoran had so much appeal at the time. I mean, you were in the basement of a museum across the street from the White House. Like, nobody else can really say that, but they went to school there. And like, you would see like Obama every once in a while, and like Joe Biden would make you late for class. So yeah, to go back to my thesis, I had proposed to photograph Detroit using a medium format camera, analog color prints, but to meld the current state of the city in 2012, 2013, and look at its past as well. So I'll start my slideshow with that, with some images of that, and then we'll kind of move on to what I'm doing now. Share screen. Okay, can you guys, everyone see everything?
Yep.
Well, let me make sure that I can find, where did my chat bar go? Where did it go?
I can also read questions out loud. I've got my chat bar pulled up.
Ooh, can you do that for me, please? I'd really appreciate it, because I don't know where it is. Okay, so everyone can see what I got on the screen?
Yep.
You're good?
Yeah, looks great.
So this is the first image of my series. It's called Elegy. I've included a couple, but there's more on my website as well if you're still interested in looking at that. So like I had mentioned, it was mixing the city's current state and looking at its past as well. So if you look, there's a skyline, a very faint skyline in the bottom, in the middle of the image, and then those black and white like architectural photographs layered on top. And that's actually acetate applied directly onto a chromogenic print, which is an analog color photograph. And I found them while doing research of specific buildings that had been destroyed in the last 100 years within the city. And some of them still do exist. For example, there's the Hudson's department store. It's like the small black and white building on the right side of the image. So that was like our equivalent of Macy's in Detroit up until the early 90s. And it was demolished at the beginning of that decade. And what was weird was that it was publicized on TV, like it was recorded, and all of the local news like sources had a live feed of it, and it was almost like this like celebration of exploding a building in the middle of the city, which I thought was really weird. And we have a history of doing that within the city. Here's another one as well. So all of those white figures on the
Megan
bottom.
says, where did you find these images and archive, etc.? I think you shot these, right?
The color images, I shot them. The black and whites are pulled from like the Detroit Public Library archives. Some of them are from like different printing services, like postcard factory, or not factories, but companies at the turn of the century. Some of them are from books that I collect. I have a huge collection of like books about Detroit. So they came from a variety of sources. So here's the second image from the series. So this was one of the busiest intersections in the city, in the middle, like 50s, in the 40s, 50s. And I went in on a Saturday afternoon, and you could literally stand in the middle of the street. No one was there. So I kind of wanted to bring life back to it, or what it would have been like in its heyday. So those white figures are all painted in. It's simply just a
size on these pieces, Jess?
Huh?
What's the size on these pieces?
The sizes of these, they're about 2 feet by 2 feet, so they're big. Yeah, I was able to use a medium format, so then I had a bigger negative to then blow them up larger, using a Hasselblad to shoot. Again, this is another one using archival images. I can't remember the source of the cars, but I know it's pulled from that factory from Packard Automotive that actually went belly up quite a long time ago. And using elements from the actual structure that's in the color photograph, but finding it photographed prior to when everything fell, if that makes any sense. Am I clear on that? Yeah, okay. So at this time, then I graduated from the Corcoran and I was moving to New York City to participate in the Aperture Work Scholar program. It's an internship with a nonprofit multi-level publisher, specifically for photography. So they have a quarterly magazine. They do several artist monographs and compilations of books every year. And so I was in the production department. So my job there was to essentially help with organizing printing, making sure that like printing proofs were the right color, or the right, they had any more, making sure that things were the way the photographer wanted them to be seen, ready for print. Ooh, what does this mean? Oh, chat.
I was just letting them know to go visit Aperture if they haven't already.
Oh, yeah. Yeah,
and the Scholar program is incredible. If you guys get the chance to go look into that, it's an internship.
And there's a couple of other internship programs with them. I just went through the Work Scholar one, but I mean, check them out, follow them on Instagram. They're amazing. I only have good things to say about Aperture. So yeah, I was working with images, looking at photographs all day. And I mean, in some ways I was looking at masters and I was like, I will never make a photograph like that. I just can't do it. And I had lost access to color processor. I didn't know where to do that in New York my first year here. So I decided to like really try to paint in my apartment. So I was stretching canvas by for the first time without even really knowing what I was doing. Based off of like family photographs I had like scans of, or like screenshots of like newsreel footage. And that was just kind of like my way of making things while I was living here my first year. And my time at the Aperture Foundation came to a close and I started applying to jobs. And I think I applied to like 20 jobs that summer and didn't even get an interview for anything. I was really, really blue at the end of that summer, just being like, I need something. Like, I can't just like update my resume and keep sending it out. Like, I need to do something. And I saw this opportunity online to intern for Hank Willis Thomas. He's a conceptual artist here based in New York. He started off in photography and his practice has expanded like tenfold since he really kind of has become recognized. And so I interned for Hank, and I did that for 4 months. And then I was asked to become his production manager. So that meant helping him oversee the production of every piece made in his studio. So I was working with foundries, even though I had never, like, sculpture was such a, like, it was Mars to me. I had no idea what I was getting myself into. We worked with quilters. And then Hank was making mirrors at the time. Like, he was really starting to kind of discover that medium. And he asked me to help him. And I fell in love. It's almost like it's really weird. It's a process that like most people don't know about, but it's all liquid. And
you want to go ahead, just show them one of them while you're talking about it, the one that you have from spring break.
Yeah.
Go back.
No, go through everything. Don't look.
Oh no, you can do that first mirror that you made, the 2 portraits.
Oh anyway. Yeah. Thank you. I'll do that. Now you guys just saw everything. Where'd it go? Looked great. Thank you. So it's this process where you end up pouring ammonia and then there's silver nitrate involved. It's not light sensitive, but there is a very similar muscle memory to like agitation to deposit silver onto the glass. So it's almost like agitating like a developing tray with your print and watching it bloom. It's really beautiful to like see happen. But I don't have any of that on this PowerPoint, but if you follow me on Instagram, I usually record follow my stories. So I ended up quitting the studio at Hank's because I really wanted to like refine my own practice. I went to graduate school here in New York City at NYU, and I spent my first year there making really bad paintings. Like, I kept making the same paintings I was making in my apartment, and I just was not getting the results I wanted. There were so many things I struggled with. Like, I hated the surface of my paintings. I was still just working with acrylic on like panels, very rarely canvas. I was just not happy. And so my last year there, my first
in fine art or photo at NYU for grad?
NYU, the MFA program at NYU that I was in is a studio art program, and that's the name of the major is, or like your concentration is studio art. So it's super interdisciplinary. It's a 20-person program, so you've got like somebody who will be painting for 2 months and then all of a sudden go into photography to then come back into like working with fiber arts. It's pretty much you can just play and discover yourself that way and kind of hone your practice like that. So for me, I was dead set on making paintings, and then all of a sudden I started playing with making mirrors my second year there. I kind of went back to the familiarity of glass and like my fascination with silver deposits onto glass when I was working at Hanks, and kind of being like, I'm going to try this for myself and see what happens. And these are the results of the first two pieces I made. They're pretty small. They're 8 by 10. So the figure on the right, if you like that bluish, purplish kind of tone in there, that's actually a mirror. So when you look at it in person, you end up seeing yourself in that portrait. And the one on the left, there's a mirror on the back of it. So like where her eyes kind of like that, like sparkle in her mouth, there's a mirror behind it. So that changes with whatever the reflection is facing that piece. It's both acrylic on glass, which you got to work really fast with because it dries quite quickly on glass. So they were just little tests to see like what the possibilities were for myself. And this was the big aha moment. It's a little bit larger. It's 16 by 20. And again, that gray you see in the water there is silver. So if you saw it in person, you'd see yourself within those sections. It's acrylic on glass, and there's about 4 or 5 panes in there. So there's a little bit of a dimensionality to it, and like depth. And so
together, how are you?
They're essentially just sandwiched next together. So once everything's painted, you drop one paint in on top of another paint in on top of another paint in. And so like you really depend on the frame to keep everything together. So while I was working on this one, I was painting it on the back. So the paint's always applied on the back, and I kept flipping it. And it's a super thin piece of glass, and I'm like, well, I'm gonna break it at some point. And I sat there and I was like, there's gotta be an easier way to do it. So I ended up flipping the glass upside down. So when I was painting this, I decided the top of that sailboat was like the sky was the closest thing to me. Does that make sense, everyone? And so I was painting upside down and backwards. And it just clicked. Like I know I sound like a nut, but it clicked for me. And so in order to see what I was painting, I'd have to like open it, almost like a hinge. So lifting it up and down. So I'm painting blind, essentially. And then I was introduced to oil paint. I always thought working with oil was like the most terrifying thing. I just was like, I can't do that. And I had a friend sit me down with a couple tubes and a panel, and I played around one afternoon. I was like, okay, I got the hang of this. Let's try it on glass. So this is one of my images or an in-progress shot of a piece I made for my graduate thesis, where I was painting images of my family's summer home that had been destroyed the year prior. It was a really weird summer to like watch this house kind of fall apart. And I was going through a photo album while I was visiting my parents, and there were just these like really beautiful like snapshots of the interior in like the 70s, 80s. So I was like rebuilding it for myself and visually with like my medium of choice. So this is an in-progress shot, and that yellow you see is a masking system I use. So it allows me to have like super crisp edges. So it's like the first couple of days of working on it. And then the introduction of the second panel in the back. So you'll see like that floral couch and like a table. So you can kind of start to see it get built together.
How many layers at that point? Is that just 2 layers?
That's 2 layers. Yeah,
okay.
2 layers. And then this is just like a detail to show you like what it looks like when the masking is removed. And then it becomes that.
And the final is, do you usually use 4 layers, or is it just depend on the piece?
It depends on the piece. Megan, you just posed a question. With this and the work with Detroit, it seems the theme of destruction or loss is pretty prevalent. Do you find yourself returning to these themes in glass paintings? Yes, but no. I think like, yeah, loss definitely. I was writing in graduate school about my work, and the last line of this like manifesto pretty much was, to put it simply, to put it short, I just paint to mourn. And it's always about like this loss of time, this loss of importance, that eventually things become obsolete, whether it be like our memories or like physical objects. I've always just been drawn to that, like trying to preserve something, but no matter how much you try to preserve something, you can never like keep it as is. So yeah, this would be, so that's one of the images, so that's complete. So that's 3 panes of glass. Then this is another one from that series, same series. And to give you an idea of what these look like from the back, this is almost done. So I have to do my details first because that's the first thing you see, and then I do my underpaintings last, as opposed to doing my underpaintings and then do the detail. So in here, this is pretty much the underpainting.
Back and forth so we can see the front and the back.
Yeah. So you'll see like that green couch. The tables in like is like still, I hadn't covered that up yet, so there's still like highlights and stuff and like that there, but everything else is pretty much just like an underpainting. But you kind of get like a gist of like where shapes are. Yeah. And what's nice too is like, because you can see across, I'll like make to-do lists. So that's what that is, like backing window, mantle, cabinet, glass by window, table. Yeah, I like to make notes like that to myself. And here's,
I know you mostly pull all your images from like family photos. Is there something that you're looking for when you're going through them, or do they just strike you as images that you want to use?
Oh, I think it depends on what I'm trying to do that day. Cause like I'll look at images and just like saying something like, oh, I really love that shape, or like that would be interesting to paint. But I oftentimes when I select images, I look at them as a photographer, of like, oh, I really like that shadow there, or like it's almost like putting on like photographer hat comes back on, and then like painter hat comes back on later. But I mean, while I'm also looking at images, I'll try to like dissect how I want to do it in my head, especially as of late, because I started like removing the figures out, or like playing around with like just like kind of like leaving the physical objects. I've been considering that of like placement, or if I have like multiple shots of the same scene or place, I'll start kind of like really dissecting and be like, what makes this image more compelling than the other? Mm-hmm. So now I've finished graduate school, and I've been doing that for the last 2 years, is trying to be a full-time artist, really kind of looking at photographs, especially like family snapshots, and dissecting them and seeing like their importance within a frame, and like playing with the physicality of what a photograph means, and its importance. So this is, it's a beat up car that was in my grandfather's yard, and I found it in one of his family albums when I went to go visit him. And splitting it into kind of looking at both like the front and the back of it. And really, I was really interested in just this one section of the car that was completely beaten up. It was almost like Frankenstein. It was like pieced together by multiple models.
One of my favorite things with your work, Jess, is that you have this ability to take a photograph that is a reproducible image and take it back and almost elevate it or take it out of that realm into the realm of painting, where you have this singular object, or sculpture where you have this singular object, but you're still referencing all these things that you've studied in photo, and they still look and sound and resonate like photos, which has always been very fascinating to me. That they still feel like photos, even though they're not necessarily a photograph per se.
And That's also a critique to my work though too, is I'll have a show sometimes and people will be like, that's a nice nice photo. And I'm like, no, it's a painting. So it's like, it's good, but it's bad. So it's just something I have to compete with.
Did you do this one on 2 separate panels?
Yeah, so they are two separate pieces with 2 panels. So that white frame is painted, and the car in the house on the right, on the rectangle on the right, that's on one pane, and then like the background, so like those houses in the back and the sky and those electrical wires are a different pane. Yeah.
So your framer doesn't like you very much, is what I'm thinking.
Oh no, I frame my own stuff. I don't trust anyone. I'm very, very nervous about anyone framing
to get all those into the same frame.
It's not that hard, actually. I'm very nervous about letting people, because I don't want them to. They're really fragile because I feel like the paintings themselves almost act like the information on a negative. So if you scratch the painting, that information no longer exists. And it's the same thing with if you scratch a negative, that information no longer exists. Ooh, did I get another? Oh no. Okay, so it's again similar themes of like looking at the photograph, and then I can tell you a bit about this one. The title is "Keep This." I found this photograph, the photograph that I base this off of, in a shoebox, and it shows my grandfather kissing his best friend. And I flipped the back of it, and on the back was somebody in pen had written like Ed Lundy's birthday in 1970, I can't remember the date, and Fran Lancaster, who's my grandfather. And on the bottom of it, it just said, "Keep this." And I showed it to my dad, and I was like, when was this? And he's like, I don't remember. And I'm like, but it's curious because somebody took the time to write this word there, but nobody seems to remember when this was taken or like where. Nobody can remember the house. No one can remember details of it. So that kind of just drew me in. I felt so much more in love with that image, just from that inscription, that moment, and those discussions I had about the source image. So if you look closely, if your screen's big enough, you'll see these like little disruptions in the image. So like in the middle of it, there's like a Kodak stamp, and then there's like text, and that says this paper is manufactured by Kodak, kind of referencing the front and the back of the photograph. And then if you join this early enough, I was telling Megan about a show I just had right before we had to go into lockdown. I de-installed like the day before we had to like all start to shelter in place. I was lucky enough to work with an independent curator who's based here in Brooklyn. Her name is Marie-Salomé Peronel, and she proposed to the Spring Break art show of a booth kind of looking at fragments of memory. And we worked together to make sure that the booth was not just like white walls, but kind of like transform the space into a domestic, like almost home, but fragmented home. So the wood paneling references that house that we like looked at, I showed you earlier. Obviously it's not the same stuff, but it still mimics the same feeling. The floral wallpaper kind of like ages it as well. The table in the middle of the room is, I have it in my studio, I actually use it, but it was also my craft table as a kid. And before that, my mother had inherited it from a family member. So there's all of these layers of like why I keep things, or it's like almost trying to again prevent that loss that Megan was asking about earlier. So yeah, this was installs from that show, and I can show you some pieces from that. So this is Elm.
A really good example of the reflective qualities of the mirror in that last slide.
Yeah, I was about to point that out. Thank you, Jason. So on the left-hand side, you'll see that this is the piece. You see it in place, installed. And this is what it looks like when it's photographed against a white background or reflecting white. This is a mirror. Each section is mirrored individually. So I use, again, my masking system. I cut away the shapes that I want to mirror. That gets mirrored. I pull away and cut more shapes and then mirror it selectively. So by the end, maybe you're mirroring it like 8 or 9 times. So these, you guys can't see my cursor, right? No?
I don't think so.
Okay, that's a shame.
No, we can see it.
We can.
You can see it?
Yeah.
Okay,
It's
cool.
a little light, but we can see it.
Okay. So over here, so there's like this section here and like this section here. Like this like brown stuff. It's actually kind of like orangey in person, but that's actually where the mirror starts to kind of disintegrate itself because it's been silvered so many times. And so I like that. I like that quality. And it shows that like it's been silvered so many times. In terms of hanging, this isn't framed. There's these two like plastic rosettes at the top. Those are, they're the same like hanging mechanisms you would use to like hang a mirror in like an old lady's house. They're actually really hard to find nowadays. I like go to mom and pop home, like hardware stores and like buy their stock. So now I have like a stockpile of them. And the piece itself, like I buy my glass as like rectangles and squares, but I've been like now kind of trying to stay away from like the traditional photographic frame and chipping away at the glass. So I break it myself, I sand the edges down, and it's very much kind of like a game of chance to do that.
You got two questions. Megan says, do you often install in constructed environments?
No, I don't. I like to show really like white cube spaces and have like one piece on every wall. I like to have it very sterile. But that's kind of the interesting thing with working or showing at spring break is that they kind of, they don't discourage, but they kind of like it when the space becomes immersive. So that was a challenge for me to do that. But I really loved the final product of it. It was a treat to do.
And then you got another question from Billy. Do you paint directly onto it? I'm assuming the glass. Do you recommend starting with the background or the subject, or do you start with the background or the subject?
Oh, that's hard. It depends on what you're working, but yeah, I think subject. If you're gonna take a stab at this, subject, because then like the background's a little bit more forgiving. Like once your subject's dry, then you can kind of like be a little bit looser with the background, as opposed to like doing the background and then having to like go in very finely with a small brush and like being very worried about edges and things. Yeah, so subject first. This is again an example of chipping away at my paintings, again, breaking the glass, kind of trying to get away from this frame and looking more at fragments. This piece is like pretty small. It's like 9 by like 11, something like that. So I don't have the dimensions off the top of my head on this one. But it was a little bit larger when I started painting it, and I got quite frustrated working on it. And there were parts where I was like, I'm just gonna throw this away. And I was like, but what if I just take a hammer to it? And I literally was like taking a hammer while I was painting, removing the parts I didn't like. So it was like not a happy, I mean, like obviously there's chance involved, but it was like a great kind of discovery to do that. And lastly, there is Memento. So just prior to spring break, I was in Key West, Florida for a month doing a residency there at the studios of Key West. And I had proposed to them to make a piece using their public archive. And like the public library of Key West has an amazing like selection of images. They have like 200, like they have like a whole section dedicated to trophy fish. And so I was really fascinated with that, of like, it's looking at an object as like a remnant of like a souvenir that you cannot take home with you. So the only thing you can take home with you is the photograph. And I became fascinated with just like the, like over the last 100 years, all of these images that have been collected of literally these dead fish. And I really fell in love with this one specific image, and just decided to, you know, again, remove the human figure and make it just simply about like the remnants of those actions. So this is Memento. And then lastly, there is Amnesia. Again, removing the human figure and kind of like trying to blend it in or camouflage them back into the domestic space. So it's really kind of like just remnants of that. Yeah.
Awesome. Can you tell us a little bit more about the process with getting residencies or internships, or what that looked like for you in terms of research, or kind of how you made the decision?
Yeah, how should I approach this question? So of course I spend a lot of time painting and working in the studio, but I also doing a lot of administrative work is a huge part of like being an artist. So it's looking for opportunities, especially as like an emerging artist. You don't always have somebody knocking on your door to give you something. You really have to you really have to kind of dig for your own opportunities and start like that. And then from there, your network will get bigger. And then from there, people will approach you. So I spend a lot of time on websites like the New York Foundation for the Arts Classifieds is like a gold mine for finding things to apply to. Callforentry.com is another one. If you follow like certain like art, there's a lot of things you can follow on Instagram that will give you opportunities as well, or like open calls, stuff like that. So it's a whole other section of my job is to do that. Yeah.
And then Billy asks, do you have advice on the technical aspect of your figures, especially when you're working with oil paint?
Oh man, Billy. This is where I have a hard time explaining things because I don't really know how I do it. I will sit and like work in my head how things are working, like how to paint it. And honestly, like the human figure terrifies me to paint it. It's like pulling teeth. It's so not easy, at least in my experience. I start with sketches and then slowly work your way with oil. Oil's forgiving. It is a forgiving medium compared to other things. But that's all I can really tell you. I'm really sorry. I'm not, I'm not the best at explaining that process. And then I see Nicholas. No.
Yeah.
I see Nicholas posed a question of how do you access the photo archives? I am a hoarder of like digital files. So I have like a lot of my paintings are based off of family photographs and a lot of them are my family's photographs. So when I go back to visit my parents, I will just go in the closet, grab the photo albums and spend like the next 3 hours taking pictures on my phone. And that's how I have them. I upload them to my computer when I get back to New York. Same thing, like if I like different family members, I'm always like, I'll sneak and go just, it's like sneaky stealth work. I'm always just kind of doing that. And it's now normal in my family. It was a really hard time for them to accept that. Other photo archives, contacting local associations. So like the New York, or not the New York, the Studios of Key West. I just plugged in Key West Public Library photos and I was able to find their archive. A lot of times, like just having those searches is really easy. I had applied to a residency in Holland, Michigan, and like I discovered their public library has great images too online, and so does their museum. So it's just kind of like, that's how I've always done it that route. And then if I can't really find anything, then I'll call a source and ask for permission, or sometimes you have to pay to have access to some archives. So I'll do that as well. Billy Wynn, do you have artist inspirations? Yes. I have one painter who I absolutely adore, and his name is Dyke Blair, Dike Blair, Blair. And he does these beautiful little, like, still like they look photographic, but they're done on panels, oil on panel, or sometimes like gouaches, and he'll make like a doorknob look interesting. And I'm a total fangirl. Do you often try to pair residency applications with locations that have archives or are adjacent to? Yes, I almost always think about that. I always kind of like look at the location, the history of the location I'm applying to, and seeing like what's interesting about that, or what can I bring to that, or that's kind of like, what kind of conversation can we have? Billy, what type of art have you been making during quarantine? I'm working on 2 very small paintings because I paint right where I'm sitting right now. And it's not been easy, but working in the same vein, like little experiments here and there on glass. I made a mirror a couple of weeks ago, but that's still like in the halfway stages because I'm waiting on getting some more glass delivered. But I've been trying to keep busy with working with like sewing. I'm baskets. I'm a huge basket collector. Jason can attest to that. And so I've been like weaving my own baskets in my apartment. When you're using family photos, are you directly referencing the photo, or do you alter the subject matter at all? Yeah, it depends on what it is. I usually will modify certain things, or like I'll remove objects sometimes if I don't think they're relevant to what I'm trying to speak to. Or they're never exactly one to one. Sometimes I'll try to like clarify things better. Like there were things that I had discovered in my graduate thesis, like an American flag in one of the pieces. And I was like, did not know that until I was halfway through the painting. I was like, wait, that's an American flag. Let's make that even more obvious than trying to render it one to one. Yeah.
Do you have any books or readings? Like I know both of us referenced Andy Grunberg's Crisis of the Real quite a bit, or other ones. Do you have any texts that you find yourself coming back to, or, and if not, it's okay. I just was wondering if you had ones that line up with your work.
I do, but it's like not something that is like glued to the back of my head. I like it's not something I have from memory. I do have like a notebook of quotes that I've like saved throughout the year. So there's definitely things about photography in there, painting in there, and like I'll flip back through it sometimes to like reference things if I'm trying to like have a certain discussion. But like my memory's not that great that I don't have a bibliography in my head. I'm sorry. Do you alter the photos before you paint with Photoshop or Collage, or do you go as you paint? I don't modify things digitally. The only thing I will do is like essentially change the perspective of a photograph, because it's like when you're taking a picture of a picture on an iPhone, it's never going to be perfectly straight. So I'll modify that, and then after that, it's like while I'm painting. I don't like Photoshop. I don't like doing things digitally unless I have to. Yeah, I'm a little old lady stuck in an old lady's body. Yeah.
Well, we're coming to our last probably 5 to 10 minutes here. Does anybody have any last questions for Jess before we head out? I want to thank you, first of all, for joining us today. It was really awesome to hear more about your work.
Thanks, Jason.
Yeah.
Thanks for having me, guys. It was really fun.
Billy loves your work.
Thanks, Billy. Anna, what's the most glass layers you've used in one piece? Thanks, Nicholas. Glass layer, okay, so it's a max of like, it depends on the thickness of the glass. So I have made, the most I've ever used in one piece is like 6 layers, but that's like super thin glass. But then I've also made like a 2-layer painting that was like 2 feet by 2 feet, and the glass went like, when both layers were connected, it was 3/4 of an inch thick and weighed about 40 pounds. So you got limitations to it. Is there a specific type of glass you work with? I like tempered glass, so that it's heat treated so that it doesn't shatter like annealed glass does. There's a difference. So like annealed glass is just like regular glass you would have like in a little picture frame, and then tempered glass is the stuff that you have like in a car. And then there's other variations to it, like so there's low iron glass, which has like less of that green tint to it that you guys would like think of, and that's really great to work on because you can like really not, you can barely tell it's glass. Maybe you talked about this and I missed it, but would you create a glass painting from a photograph that you took? I have done that. I think there might be 1 or 2 pieces that Jason had put on the Instagram on like I think it's called Tomb. It's like of a swimming pool with like 2 chairs. That's from a photograph I took. I'm trying to think if there's anything in the PowerPoint that is, nope.
The ones in Detroit you took.
Oh, obviously.
Yeah.
Course, but they're photographs with painting on them. They're not paintings of photographs. Right. Are all of your pieces from photographs? Let me try to think. Yep. Everything's from a photograph. Some of them I take, some of them I find, some of them belong to my family, but I mean, I will always love photographs. I don't think I'm that great of a photographer. I just love photographs. Yeah, so they're all from photographs, Billy.
Cool. I think that may be all of them, but I just wanted to give you a snap of applause today again. This was really, really awesome. And thank you all for coming. Does anybody have any last comments or questions they want to throw in before we head out today?
I think we're good. Yeah.
Thank you, Jessica. This has been great.
Of course. Thanks for having me. Bye, guys. Have a good one.
Thank you. I miss you, Jess. We'll talk soon.
Yeah. Bye. Nice to meet you, Megan.